main sections for the day. I'll try to talk for about maybe 45-ish minutes, and then we'll do a little bit of question and answer stuff. Obviously, if you guys have to get rolling out of here by 2, I'll hope to have the main substance out for you guys so you guys can roll out, and then we'll just kind of do questions and answers loose to the end. And with that, we will get right into it. First of all, thank you guys for coming. Raise your hands real quick if you guys have in the past like competed, signed up for, done an event within the endurance realm. Awesome. And who kind of maybe aspires to in the future? Cool. Yeah, some of you, nice. Some of you guys are like, I did a half marathon once. I don't ever want to do it again. It was the worst experience ever. That's the boat that I'm in. All right? Nice kid. He's like, yeah, I'm feeling you. All right. Take a second, drink in the meme. Tried to provide some memes for you guys today. Right. Right. So, today we're going to talk first a little bit about substance, why we want to focus on endurance training, why the aerobic system is so important, and some different conceptual things so that we understand kind of what we're focusing about. And then also really how this pertains into CrossFitters specifically. Some of the main traps that I've seen in about 12 or 13 years of coaching CrossFit and programming CrossFit and doing CrossFit, and how the easiest way to correct that, or the lowest hanging fruit for most athletes, can be fixed by some of this stuff, okay? So, why we should focus on endurance training. So, 10 general physical skills, if you guys are a CrossFitter. Stamina and endurance, cardiovascular endurance, are 2 of the 10 main components of fitness. So they are equivalent to, we treat all of those the same, right? And we don't want to think about focusing strength or power or speed without focusing those other 8 or 9 general physical skills. So that's one of the big things, and that talks just to the well-roundedness of the athlete. So we get a lot of people who are maybe skewed a little bit one direction, and to round ourselves out and round ourselves around, a lot of people's lowest hanging fruit is going to be the aerobic system. And this is typically underdeveloped in CrossFitters, right? If I would say probably one thing that we see out of most CrossFitters, especially once they get to maybe that 2-year realm, where we've hit kind of past our honeymoon phase, and we've really started to maximize our training value, and we start to kind of cap out on our ability to PR in a lot of like the Metcons. A lot of times the lowest hanging fruit for us to get better is to increase the tank that we're working out of, okay? And we'll talk about those analogies here in a second. This is probably the most important piece, at least I think. Your recovery system is significantly improved from a better aerobic system, okay? Both in the short term and in the long term, all right? So if we think about this as it pertains to a workout, if we were doing an interval-based workout. So here's who was here the day that we did the Frans, right? Where we did a couple of Frans, 1 minute on, 1 minute off, right? So we're going high power and then recovery, high power and recovery. If you have a better aerobic system, you'll recover faster inside of those 1 minute intervals, right? And then also if we think about the longer form recovery system, so like hours and days, we'll also be flushing fresher blood, we'll be getting better systems and better recovery quicker if we have a more developed aerobic system, okay? And the less developed that is, the worse our recovery will be, which means that we can have higher intensity or more intense sessions more packed tightly together, okay? So if I have a poor aerobic system, I might not be able to recover from a high intensity day for maybe 2, maybe 3 days, okay? If I have a really developed aerobic system, I might be able to do an intense session every 4 to 6 hours, okay? And so that ability is obviously going to drastically impact our overall fitness level, okay? Longevity, so getting back into more of the health, the holistic end of things, okay, has major impacts in terms of heart health and those things. Circulation, right? So that's kind of where we go there. The other thing that I like about endurance training, it's relatively simple, right? It's not something where it costs a ton of money to go out and put some tennis shoes on and run, or walk, or bike, or anything like that. So it's relatively simple in terms of ease of access, right? If I was going to tell you, hey, we need to really develop your speed, power, and raw strength, now we're going to start needing things like resistance training implements, okay? So barbells, dumbbells, people, sandbags, etc. Other things that we may not necessarily have, okay? And then we want to be less like the Joker, okay? So we don't want to feel like we have to avoid certain days. We don't want to feel like we're afraid if our friends are like, hey, I got us signed up for this charity 5K. It's going to be so much fun. We're going to go around and it's just like 3.1 miles. It's no big deal, right? We don't want to be like, oh, oof. And like you're like really nervous about that and you don't want to do it, okay? Just as if you might be like, hey, you should come and do a CrossFit workout with me, or we're going to come and do Murph. And you want them to be like, oh my God, Murph, like I can't do that, right? We want the ability to be able to jump into those things whenever and wherever we feel like we want to. All right, so defining a little bit about what endurance training is. Okay, so these are our main energy pathways. Okay, so breaking down into the three: phosphogenic, glycolytic, and oxidative. So this is where our body is going to pull energy sources from. Okay, so our phosphogenic, think like a 1 rep max lift. Okay, very, very short, absolute max capacity of our muscles, and they're drawing on a different energy source. Okay, glycolytic, this is where a lot of CrossFit is going to be spent. Okay, somewhere between that 30-second and 2 to 2.5 minute zone. Okay, this is where we're burning a lot of sugars, right? And this is going to be something that's a little bit higher intensity. You can see this is probably upwards, maybe 80%. There's a crossover here between glycolytic and oxidative that CrossFit and a lot of now these like group fitness, functional fitness, capacity places are going to sit in between. So your Orange Theories, your Shred 415s, your F45s, there's thousands of them now. They fit really tightly into this crossover section here, okay? And the reason is because we can tap on both the anaerobic and the aerobic, okay? And so we're getting a lot of different energy pathways in that crossover. And the last then is purely that oxidative pathway, okay? And that's where we're going to be using more fats and oxygen as our energy source, okay? The other chart here, and this one I like a little bit better. So this is talking a little bit more about your energy stores and kind of how quickly you can replenish those energy stores while you're doing exercise. And then I like this because it shows you this overall performance graph, okay? And you're limited here a bit by your peak in each of these, okay? So the better our peaks are, the more this pushes, and your area underneath the graph is sort of your defined fitness or your work capacity, okay? So if we can increase our aerobic system, the cool part about this and what we'll talk about in a second is your aerobic system allows you to have higher capacities for each of these. So think of them sort of like your oxygen tank, okay? And then these are going to be sort of using the oxygen, right? And if we have a bigger oxygen tank, we can use more oxygen, right? So that's kind of what we're thinking about there. We want to increase that overall performance capacity. All right, so this is a kind of a cool quote. You guys don't need to read it. I'm not a big words on PowerPoint slides. So what you guys have come here today is for me to read these boring things with a lot of weird words. And this was the least weird wordy one that I had. And when I put it up, you guys will have it in terms of a lot of scientific phrases. But really what we're talking about here, the ceiling of the next system, okay, depends on the system before it, right? So if our aerobic pathway is basically going to set, it's kind of like that outer circle, and everything else has to fit inside of it. So if we have a small aerobic threshold, then everything else is going to be limited by that. Does that make sense? So the bigger our aerobic threshold, the more we can expand all of those other pathways, and the more fit we can become. So what a lot of people, this is kind of how I draw this, right? So we have two different types of athletes, okay? Let's say we have somebody who came in from a previous background of endurance training. They're going to have this big circle. And then you guys have seen these people before. We put them in a workout like Fran. They don't have great intensity, or we put them maybe on a rower and we're like, hey, do a 500-meter max effort row. And they go back to their like 5K pace, right? So their ability to tap into some of those other pathways might be like this. So they have all this room to go to improve their fitness on the shorter burst, higher power stuff, okay? Conversely, John, I'm going to throw you under the bus here. Is that okay? All right, we get John coming in. John's coming in from a powerlifting background. His aerobic system might more be like this, okay? But his energy systems are like that. So he is right up to the limit. And have you guys ever seen John on the Airdyne? He tries to break them every time. Have you broken one yet? A rower handle and one Airdyne. Okay. So only a couple times, all right? So the high intensity training for him is not necessarily going to net him a lot of extra value because he's pushing right into the boundaries of his aerobic system every time. So if you think about this, he's got a smaller oxygen tank, but he's able to empty it all the way, turn it on full blast, and clear it out in just a moment, okay? As opposed to somebody who's been running marathons forever, they have this gigantic oxygen tank, but they're so used to just opening it to only like 60% and just having this slow drip of oxygen, they're not able to tap into it all the way. So two different types of people. That's why I had you guys kind of raise your hands at the beginning, so you guys can kind of maybe try to tell where you guys sit on this, right? So if we think about this as it pertains to CrossFitters, two different types of people are going to gather two different types of things from the exercises that they do, okay? Any questions on that? I know that's a little bit complicated. Okay. And this source I put on here, guys, I'll send that out to you guys. Really good reading, super nerdy. So if you guys don't like nerdy, don't read it. But if you guys like nerdy, you guys can read that. It's very good. And this is kind of what they talk about. Your aerobic foundation is going to be the base of the pyramid that's going to allow things to fit with a bigger area inside of it. If we have a smaller, our total area of our triangle is going to be very limited. Okay. All right, so what is endurance training? So we're going to brief dip into a little bit of zones. There's a lot of discussion on this, okay? And, you know, as much as, you know, Orange Theory has done great things in terms of getting people kind of, you know, off their butts, getting them moving, doing some aerobic stuff, doing some functional fitness. They've sort of done a little bit of a disservice in the heart rate industry. And some of the discussions on this now are trying to get a little bit more specific, so the information out there is better. Couple things on zones. So there's a few things, I actually forgot one as we were sitting outside watching this. I remembered to talk about it. So it is modal specific, okay? Which means your max heart rate is going to be different swimming than it is going to be in here doing CrossFit than it is going to be on an Airdyne, okay? So they are modal specific, okay? We'll talk about why here in a little bit. But if we're doing something that is mixed modal, we want to know our mixed modal peak heart rate, okay? If we're going to be running, we want to know our peak heart rate as it pertains to running, which is going to be different than if we are swimming, which is more hypoxic and a little bit of a different kind of pressure on your heart, okay? So it is modal specific, it is age specific and fitness level specific, okay? So you'll get a lot of people who try to broad brush the age specific that say your max heart rate is 220 minus your age, okay? And that's kind of just a stock thing put out there. And then they had Lance Armstrong do this and he was like 42 and he pretty much just blew that totally out of the water, right? And then there's a bunch of other modalities, rowers and cyclists and stuff who are 40 and 50 years old and their peak heart rate's still in the 200s, right? So they're still capable of going well beyond that, okay? And then fitness level specific, that one's pretty obvious, right? If we don't have a very high fitness level, our peak heart rate's gonna be a little bit different than somebody who is a well-trained athlete. And then the last one, guys, one that I didn't put is environmental. Environmental sources actually play quite a bit in this. The most obvious one is elevation, right? The other one that's really obvious as we see today, heat. Okay, heat, humidity, air cleanliness. There's other things that can also affect heart rate and peak heart rates as it pertains to that. Your peak heart rate is going to be very different at sea level as it is going to be in elevation, okay? And we're going to treat that differently. So what we like to think about, these are two different, at least in my opinion, these are the best ways to gauge heart rate and rate of perceived effort. So zones 1 through 5, we've been talking about those a little bit in class. We're going to continue to try to talk about these aerobic zones. And then RP is rate of perceived effort, okay? Two different ways that you guys can kind of log things. We'll talk about each. So rate of perceived effort is a note that you would make when you complete a workout of how hard you feel like you are exerting effort. And this is the chart. It's kind of a 0, oh, this one starts at 6, to 20 chart. And you would rate, you know, hey, today I ran 1 mile, and let's say I ran it at like a 6:30, and my max is like a 5:30, right? I would put that to hard to very hard, right? It'd be like 15, 17, something like that, okay? If I was all out, that'd be a 20, maximal exertion, right? And then we kind of go wherever we want to, right? Aerobic's gonna fall somewhere in here, right? Very light to somewhat hard, okay? Somewhere in that range. And we're going to be thinking about trying to make sure that we don't exceed those capacities as we're trying to train the aerobic system. And then a little bit more specific is going to be your zones. Now, we talk about this a little bit in terms of the conversation test, okay? How much are we feeling like we're gasping for air in between our sentences is a good way to sort of design or discuss the zone 1 through zone 5, right? If you're really like, if you can't talk at all, obviously we're peaked out at zone 5, right? If you guys feel like, hey, we're conversational, but there's a couple breaths in between, or maybe in between that zone 3, zone 4, right? And if we're zone 1, zone 2, we should be able to keep up relatively normal sentences without a lot of exertion of breathing in between. And zone 1 would just be like, hey, I'm going for a walk with my friends. Okay, so it's relatively simple. So you can do a little bit of both. What we see here, guys, is that zone 3, so our moderate and aerobic zone sits between 65 and 80% of our max heart rate, okay? That's where we want to be training to increase that overall gas tank. Now, when we get from 75 to 80%, and then from 80 to 85%, we have a crossover from the aerobic zone to the anaerobic zone. Like I said, that's where a lot of CrossFit sits. So Coach Mitchell today was outside. We were doing endurance class, and he was sitting somewhere in this zone. Okay, so he was in the moderately hard to hard. So I would guess that for the majority of that, he was probably in that 80 to 90% zone, which means that we're working a little bit more of an anaerobic system, okay? So a little bit of a different energy pathway. He's not necessarily growing that big kind of oxygen tank that we talked about during that time. Instead, he's starting to work into those different energy pathways, and he's inside the circle, pushing into those boundaries. Does that make sense? So it's important to understand what we're training for. If we're trying to expand the circle, we need to be at a lower heart rate zone. And that's what's really hard. We're going to talk about that as it pertains to CrossFit here in a second. But it's hard for people like Coach Mitchell to kind of tap into because he is throttling himself back quite a bit. Okay, so we're going to talk about that here in a sec. And so we can talk about performance and fitness. What you would think about is if I go out and I track my heart rate and I run 1 mile and I run it at 6 minutes and I put my RPE at 10 and my heart rate zone sits at like an average of 70%, and then I run the exact same mile time the next year, but my rate of perceived effort is lower and my average heart rate is lower, then I have gotten more fit. Does that make sense? So we can use these to track performance. And rate of perceived effort is a really good one from a coaching perspective for us to be able to tap into the conversation with the athlete about how hard do you feel like you're working right now. And so if I were to go up to Coach Mitchell during that, he might feel like, oh, I feel like I'm like a maybe 14, 15, right? I don't feel like I'm working that hard. And it's okay. Well, maybe we need to go back and track his max heart rate on the bike, and maybe he actually is operating in that zone, right? He's just more fit than we thought he was, right? Maybe.